The South Carolina section of the novel clearly and specifically evokes both the eugenics movement of the early 20s. While I really like my day job of teaching college students, I'm increasingly interested in moving beyond the classroom setting to talk to people across Vermont about issues that I care about deeply and that I see as being directly related to and illuminating our present cultural moment. So thank you all for coming out on this chilly night for this talk. I must confess, I've been looking forward to being here for some months. Last year, I was also here in December when my partner, Professor Deb Evans, gave a talk about Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men. I remember how engaged and interested the audience was, and Cindy told us afterward that that's just how Manchester rolls on First Wednesdays. So I'm here hoping to catch a version of that spark tonight. Before I go any further, I want to thank Deb for coming with me and listening to me ramble on about this project. She's my first and best interlocutor when I think about 19th century American culture. And this project is better, as they always are, for her insightful questions and observations. I also want to say a word about the new title for this presentation, which came to me just this weekend via my college roommate, Phil Stowers, who's a docent at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was in touch with him over the Thanksgiving break. I told him about this talk, and he shared with me that 2 days prior, when he was giving a tour, one of his guests asked to see the tracks and the cars that people had used on the Underground Railroad. Now, while we might choose to titter or sneer at that, I'm more inclined to look at it as a clear indication of just how amorphous and misguided our collective understanding of this thing, or these things and people, called the Underground Railroad, is even today. My hope tonight is to cast some light on the subject and give you all some food for thought about why we're so obsessed with something that we often fundamentally misunderstand. Just like the title for my presentation, my research has been evolving over the months since I committed to giving this presentation. Part of what that means is the description of the talk that the Vermont Humanities Council published in their newsletter doesn't exactly line up with what I'm going to do tonight. It's still going to be a talk about the Underground Railroad and the ways that imagery associated with it get adopted and adapted, but the guiding premises for the research have changed a bit. So, by way of offering you a bit of a roadmap for the talk, here are 3 questions that I'm going to touch upon tonight. First, why might contemporary black artists be creating more pieces focusing on the Underground Railroad than ever before? And what patterns can we detect in this body of work that might help explain this fascination? Second, what are some effects of the contemporary trend among activists, journalists, and politicians to associate social issues like immigration reform, reproductive rights, and income inequality with the Underground Railroad in the popular media? Third, what can we make of our increased and increasing fascination with and fetishization of what I call my holy trinity of abolition activists: Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and John Brown? The past 5 years has seen a marked increase in creative work: biographies, novels, films, television series, and graphic novels about these 3 figures. I'm very much interested in exploring why we, as a culture, seem to need them now, and how we are remaking them as we deploy them in our contemporary conversations. Because we're limited in time tonight, I'm going to illustrate this part of the talk by selecting only one of these individuals. And because Monday was the 160th anniversary of his execution, I'm choosing to focus on John Brown. You'll note that one of the recurrent threads uniting these 3 questions is the idea of using the Underground Railroad. Now, while one might reasonably argue that just about any historical event or personage can be used, as the foundation of a pattern of symbolism and allusion, I put it to you that the very amorphous nature of Americans' understanding of what the Underground Railroad was makes it particularly ripe for symbolic use, and frankly, misuse in the popular imagination. To illustrate the point, let me ask each of you to reflect on what the phrase, the Underground Railroad, conjures for you. By show of hands, and let me stress that I'm not passing judgment on anyone for their answers, how many of you hear the phrase, the Underground Railroad, and think of benevolent white people, like Manchester's own Joseph Burr or Rowland Robinson of Ferrisburg, who aided terrified and exhausted fugitives in flight from brutal slave masters and slave catchers who hunted their human prey like animals? Okay. How many of you think of fierce, fearless, almost superhuman blacks like Harriet Tubman, who risked everything to lead bands of fugitives to freedom by repeatedly eluding, outsmarting, and occasionally even overpowering white slave catchers? Okay. How many of you think of highly organized and extensive networks of conductors who moved fugitives from station to station in secret, perpetually fearing discovery by their neighbors who might or might not betray them to the authorities? Okay? Thank you for being willing to play along with me. There are any number of other loaded or leading questions that I could have posed to you to make the point. There's some disconnects between what's been documented about Underground Railroad activity and how we imagine it. For the purpose of having a common understanding of what it was, I turn to historian David Blight, the editor of Passages to Freedom, The Underground Railroad in History and Memory, a 2004 volume produced for the opening of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. And just as an aside, if you have an opportunity to visit the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, I highly recommend it. It's sited on the banks of the Ohio, which before 1850, in the passages of the Fugitive Slave Law, many people thought of as the River Jordan. It was the barrier between enslavement and freedom. It also happens that the museum is situated on the spot where Margaret Garner, the inspiration for Toni Morrison's Beloved, first stepped foot with her family on free soil in 1856. And it's profoundly moving to be there, in my experience. So if you have the chance, if you're down Cincinnati Way, that is something to see. The book that I'm talking about that they produced for the opening of the Freedom Center has a number of fascinating essays in it. And in its introduction, David Blight writes the following. Historically, what we today call the Underground Railroad was the process, sometimes organized in a network, but more often not, by which slaves escaped northward to the Free States, to Canada, or to points south, west, and out to sea. Broadly, it consisted of the individual and collective actions of thousands of enslaved people who were trying to achieve liberty. This traffic in escaped slaves exerted pressure on slavery itself and prompted a small but important group of abolitionists to resist the law by aiding fugitives to freedom. So there's sort of a foundational explanation of what the Underground Railroad was. If time permits, during the Q&A, we can talk about how and why individuals and groups throughout the 19th and 20th century have transformed that process into the stuff of legend that defines the railroad for so many people. For now, though, building on that common understanding, I want to say a few things about how and why some contemporary black artists seem to be imagining the Underground Railroad in our present cultural moment. On the left is the cover of the first of the novelist Colson Whitehead, the book that I want to talk about by him, The Underground Railroad, which won the 2016 National Book Award for Fiction, the 2017 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, and the 2017 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction, among other things. Out of curiosity, can I just see how many of you have read it? Okay, wonderful. If you haven't, again, I highly recommend it. Christmas is coming. Ask for a book. If you have, you'll likely not be surprised when I say that I think it's one of the best American novels written in the last decade or so. It's certainly the novel that I've been most excited and inspired by. Indeed, this whole project that I'm in the midst of springs initially from my encountering two sources at roughly the same time: Whitehead's novel and a very, very good television show called Underground that ran on WGN for 2 seasons and that you can find on iTunes if you're interested. I'm happy to talk about Underground in the Q&A if you'd like, but for now I want to focus on the novel. For those of you who haven't read it, and for those who haven't read it recently, here's the briefest of plot summaries. A pair of enslaved individuals, Cora and Caesar, flee their Georgia plantations, seeking freedom on the Underground Railroad, which is depicted in the novel as an actual subterranean rail transport system. Along the way, Cora finds temporary shelter in a government school for blacks in South Carolina, in a garret in the North Carolina home of a reluctant abolitionist, and in a utopian community of freedmen and fugitives in Indiana. Suffering, relief, despair, and hope ensue. Looking at reviews of the novel and discussing it with peers, I found that consistently people highlighted the same element of the text. The Underground Railroad is a real train. This might account for the question that the visitor to the Stowe House asked my friend Phil. That idea is abroad powerfully in the land right now, and Whitehead's novel is a large part of why. For all that, I must confess that at first, that was in some ways the least interesting detail of the novel to me personally, and not just because I can be a cranky contrarian. After all, we know that Henry David Thoreau took fugitives from Concord to Fitchburg, Massachusetts, where they could board the train for Brattleboro, Vermont. We know that the Robinsons took former slaves from Rokeby to Vergennes, where they could board a train to Burlington and ultimately travel by rail to Montreal. And we know that Frederick Douglass escaped enslavement by riding the train from Baltimore to Philadelphia disguised as a sailor. What's so revolutionary or innovative about Colson Whitehead's portrayal of an actual Underground Railroad? To me, at first, at least, what made the book compelling was Whitehead's fluid interweaving of temporal elements from African American history that don't fit together, as well as his evocation of iconic events in the history of enslavement that deepened the substance and impact of this story. The North Carolina section of The Underground Railroad borrows directly from the narrative of Harriet Jacobs, the author of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, the autobiography of a woman who spent 7 years hiding in a 9 by 3 by 4 foot attic above her grandmother's storeroom attached to her house there in Edenton, North Carolina, as the main phase of her flight from freedom. Also, to my first point, the South Carolina section of the novel clearly and specifically evokes both the eugenics movement of the early 20th century and the Tuskegee experiments, when African Americans infected with syphilis were denied treatment so that the U.S. Health Department researchers could study the progression of the disease. And part of what I see when I look at this blending of events across time is a powerful statement about the importance of imagining these discrete, temporally discrete, but experientially similar events together. Whether Cora is pushed towards sterilization, as she is, or hidden in an attic where she's forced to witness weekly lynching rituals carried out on the town square below her, it's all about the recurrent idea that as a black woman, she has to constantly fight for control of her own body. On the plantation in Georgia, or in flight on the railroad, or in the company of Ridgway, the slave catcher obsessed with returning her to bondage, mainly to protect his reputation and his perfect record. Cora is always fighting for that freedom and the agency that attends it. And the novel pointedly shows us that this struggle, the embodied experience of resisting oppression, interpenetrates all eras of American history. Now, alongside that, what to make of those actual trains? Why might Whitehead need to put that detail in? How might they be understood to serve the novel's larger purpose? Well, upon reflection, I think that the novel deploys this notion of actual trains underground as a means of concretizing this thing, this mythologized and fetishized object that we call the Underground Railroad, so that readers cannot look away from the realities of either the circumstances that drove enslaved people to flee and allies to assist them, or the costs and consequences of making such an effort. Like the idea of a train, the Underground Railroad. Hear the capital letters there? I mean the myth, not the actual process, as Blight put it. The Underground Railroad can stand as a thing of beauty, a noble iron horse carrying the nation forward towards progress and freedom. Unfortunately, real trains, especially in the 19th century, were ugly, smelly, smoky, frightening, and dangerous beasts. And the reality of their development and their impact on the nation is far from clean. In a similar way, while the Underground Railroad mythology presents a version of our best values, as people reached across racial lines in an effort to combat injustice, the realities are much, much more complicated. By fusing the mythological and the actual, Whitehead pushes his readers beyond easy romanticism and towards a more complete assessment of our greatest national sin. Now, just as I see Whitehead choosing to make an idealized abstraction real in his novel, I see other contemporary Black artists engaged in their own versions of a similar project. In the interest of time, although there are many who come to mind, I'm going to restrict myself to a few comments about a visual artist, Glenn Ligon. For those of you who haven't encountered his work, Ligon is a conceptual artist based in New York whose identities as a gay Black male deeply inform his work. And in just a second, I'm going to show you a few images from an installation called To Disembark, which was inspired in part by the famous story of Henry Box Brown. This is a 19th century woodcut reproduction of the moment when Henry Box Brown achieves his freedom. Brown was a fugitive who lived in Richmond, Virginia, where he was enslaved and worked in a factory. He enlisted the help of a free Black man and a sympathetic white carpenter to make him a crate, to seal him up inside it, and to mail him to Philadelphia to the offices of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. The tale of his journey is quite something. It's quite arduous. We're talking about a 2 by 3 foot shipping crate, essentially, that he was inside for several days. And when he emerged in the offices of the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society, it was something of a resurrection, which is sort of what this image is trying to get at here. And in fact, it's even in the title. In the wake of his famous escape, his successful escape, Brown became famous, touring with his box as a platform speaker in the effort to abolish American chattel slavery. All right, imagine that, going around not just to speak about his experience, but with the artifact, right, the material marker. And it's interesting to think, let's digress here for a second, but one of the things that's really interesting that we know about some of the platform speakers when we're thinking about abolitionism is the value of materiality. There's a famous story about Frederick Douglass being challenged by an audience member who said, "You are so articulate, so erudite, there's no possible way that you have been enslaved." And Douglass's silent response was to turn and bare his back so that the whip scars were visible. Those artifacts were valuable to 19th century audiences. And I would say that even though in the 20th and 21st century, we have made this sort of a romantic, even superheroic story about an individual achieving freedom, Glenn Ligon's installation stops us in our tracks in terms of the romance. What we have here is a photograph of the installation of To Disembark. And you have, on the left wall, you have panels from what's called the Runaway Series. These are reproductions of handbills of the sort that were often put out when fugitives were on the move, with descriptions of the individual, but with usually a generic woodcut picture of a black male or female, depending on the gender of the slave who was in flight. What Glenn Ligon did for that piece on the left was get 30 of his friends to describe him in their words, and he used their descriptions, which emphasized various parts of his persona and also his physicality, to make woodcuts where he was the fugitive. And of course, what it shows is something about that notion of perception of how one is seen versus who one understands oneself to be. That's on the left. What's in the foreground are the shipping crates. Again, the 2x3 size of Henry Box Brown's shipping crates, which one can walk among in the gallery. One of the things that I think is quite striking about this, to add to the sort of visceral sense of horror that these evoke, and perhaps I'm projecting. I am a claustrophobic person. The idea of being confined in a space that's 3x2 is my idea of hell, even for a little bit, much less being bounced along on a wagon over, ruddy roads for the multiple days that would have been his experience. But what Ligon did to amplify the horror, in a sense, was to put recorded sound elements inside the boxes. So you're next to one box and you hear a heartbeat, right? Or legend has it that Henry Box Brown was so happy to be free that when he came out of his coffin, he came out singing. And so there are a couple of the boxes that have recordings of someone singing 19th century songs. Right? So again, it's this effort to somehow make it more than just the box, to give the box sort of almost a life of its own, if you will. All right? If we go back to think about Henry Box Brown's story and say, this is a man who went to unimaginable lengths to secure his freedom, we've left the story at a distance, and it's a comfortable distance. It gives us a sense of safety and neutrality almost. To view this installation, by contrast, is to be confronted with the reality of what Brown chose to suffer in order to get free, which in turn sparks a deeper, more visceral understanding of what he, like other enslaved blacks, was enduring that made this journey seem preferable. All right. Now, having looked so far at some of the ways that contemporary black artists are creating pieces about the Underground Railroad in order to help us confront and more fully grasp some of the grim realities of that history, I want to shift now to my second point, the question of why contemporary artists, activists, journalists, and politicians evoke the imagery of the Underground Railroad in discussions of immigration reform, reproductive rights, and prison reform. The top left is the graphic of a group called the New Underground Railroad Movement, which is working on prisoners' rights. The top right is an illustration that appeared in the New Yorker alongside an article about the Underground Railroad for refugees. The bottom image is an image from a reproductive rights rally, and what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes is what people call the Pink Railroad. So these will give you some sort of a visual anchor for some of what I'm talking about. So a quick Google search will illustrate this point about how people are using the idea of the Underground Railroad. Articles reference the new Underground Railroad that immigrants are taking through the United States and on into Canada because of the current administration's attempts to restrict the entry of so-called undesirables in the United States. For women in states with progressive laws around abortion who seek to provide aid and shelter to women from states with retrograde abortion laws, the pathway to provide that help is commonly referred to as the Pink Railroad. In these cases, the question of why is perhaps not unclear. After all, these stories involve the movement of othered bodies from places where they experience oppression to spaces where they will hopefully be able to exercise rights and freedoms that many Americans take for granted. They involve oppressive and immoral, but allowable for the moment at least, legal restrictions imposed by either states or the nation that threaten to guarantee and extend the oppression that the fugitives are fleeing. And they involve a network of empowered and committed individuals willing to take risks and break those laws in the name of helping alleviate and dismantle that oppression. Framed that way, these analogies to the original Underground Railroad, for me at least, make a lot of sense. In the case of prison reform, this grassroots organization known as the New Underground Railroad movement seeks to fight the injustices associated with mass incarceration by organizing prisoners to deny their labor to the so-called prison industrial complex and rallying people and groups invested in correcting the problem of mass incarceration, quote, from the outside, to make sure that they give prisoners voice and influence in their organizations. Now, although the movement of bodies is very different, the New Underground Railroad does not advocate prison breaks or assist in any sort of extra-legal attempts at freedom. There's a similar spirit in this to the work of the original Underground Railroad, in that the work of freeing individuals meant that conductors and participants had to see, hear, and affirm the lives of those they were assisting. They had, in a real sense, to give the enslaved a space at the table. It's possible to talk about dismantling institutions while holding the people affected by those institutions at arm's length. And we know that many 19th century abolitionists did this. Again, in the Q&A, we can talk about racial bias within the abolitionist movement if people are interested. But the notion of that actual engagement with the individual is a part of the work of the conductors of the Underground Railroad. And so while the New Underground Railroad movement might seem less literal than the Pink Railroad analogy or the Immigration Railroad analogy, one can see how this deployment of the Underground Railroad imagery might make sense. Okay? I can't resist pointing out one more example, even though it's a little bit ludicrous to me. In 2001, African-American entrepreneur Robert Henderson published a volume entitled, stick with me, The New Underground Railroad, Breaking the Chains of Economic Bondage, Educating the Modern-Day Slave About Investments, Stocks, Bonds, and much more, citing Harriet Tubman as his inspiration. List price, $106.59. Okay. You can find it on eBay if you want to see the cover. Well, that's good for a laugh. And we're laughing why? Because this doesn't seem to be in the spirit of the Underground Railroad. The notion of wage slavery might make sense, but this is really a book about entrepreneurship, right? And citing Harriet Tubman as his hero for entrepreneurship, one might say is in some ways a misuse of an important figure. Well, okay, and it's worth a laugh, and we all can use a laugh. But it's important to remember that when you take a historical moment or movement or entity like the Underground Railroad and you symbolize it, you make it more than that process, as David Blight put it, you're setting up the possibility that that imagery can be deployed by individuals or groups whose interests and agendas are diametrically opposed to the actions and intentions of the original. Consider this. There are gun rights clubs in the United States that cite Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. for the validation of their belief in the Second Amendment, right? I think we can all understand why that is a misuse, right? But it points to the malleability of symbolism. And I think this malleability of symbolism around the Underground Railroad is part of what makes the questions, why this? Why now? So important. Why are people using this imagery now? What do they need from it? And that brings me back to thinking about what it means for the Pink Railroad, the immigration activists, and the prison reformers to call out their connections to the original Underground Railroad so determinedly. I think it has to do, once again, with wedding the ideal and the real. To align fights against oppression in our present cultural moment symbolically with the struggle against what is arguably the greatest moral evil our nation has participated in, is to invest these causes with a sense of urgency that makes them impossible to ignore. The literal resonances are interesting, but what's more compelling is the idea that there's as much at stake now around these issues as there was in the 1840s and the 1850s for fugitives. That might seem hyperbolic or hard for some to believe, and one might feel that this linkage is suspect. But the recurrent oppressive policies and practices currently plaguing the United States around things like reproductive rights, immigration rights, and mass incarceration, I would say, dramatically shorten the symbolic distance between then and now. Right? Our tendency to link the present to that particular moment is broadening, I would say, as we struggle to determine what sort of a nation we're going to be. This is a reproduction of the cover of the December issue of The Atlantic, a magazine founded incidentally by a group of New England abolitionists in 1857, which contains a series of articles about the enormous cultural, ideological, and political rifts threatening the United States right now. To evoke the notion of our national debacle and most damaging war is to amplify concerns and anxieties about our current disagreements, to hopefully spur individuals to think harder and act faster to correct this course towards self-destruction. And the editors of The Atlantic say several times in the lead essay, we're not saying that it's 1850 now. We're not saying that it's 1860. They're not saying that we are literally on the brink of civil war. But they are taking the temperature of the nation, seeing it as potentially dire enough to make it valuable to come back to this symbolism. All right? Now, in a similar vein, to equate the fights against oppression of othered bodies with the work of the Underground Railroad is to inspire us to engage in and support that work of resistance, by suggesting similarities in terms of what is at stake for those othered individuals and for the nation if we let the oppression continue. In the midst of that heightened rhetoric comes a resurgence of interest in an artistic production about my previously mentioned Holy Trinity of abolition resistance: John Brown, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman. It seems that we need each of these figures now as a response to our present cultural crises. Attendant on that are the questions of why we need each of them, what we are using each of them for, and what might be the broader consequences of conjuring and deploying these powerful, super-heroic individuals. And that notion of superheroism is one that I think is really important in this discussion. That's a thread that is longer than I want to tease out right now, but it's certainly a thing I'm glad to say more about if people are interested. This then brings me to my third point. What, to borrow from Henry Thoreau, I'm thinking of as a new plea for Captain John Brown. This is a photograph that was taken not long before Harper's Ferry. All right. I want to pause a moment, once again, and take the temperature of the room. While I'm not at all sure that some of the rest of you aren't, as I am, members of John Brown Lives, the social action network operating out of Westport, New York, near the site of his home and final resting place, I suspect there might be a variety of perceptions and opinions of Brown represented here in the room tonight. So once again, if you'll indulge me, by show of hands, I'm going to ask you to indicate if your views or beliefs about Brown fit one or more of the following descriptors, again, with no judgment of people's answers. Hero, terrorist, revolutionary, savior, madman. Oh, come on. Some of y'all are abstaining, obviously, all right? Prophet, catalyst of the Civil War, Christian martyr, role model. Thank you. What I gather from your responses is that in this audience, as in the nation at large, there's a very mixed view of John Brown. That's been true as long as John Brown has been in the public eye. Although there's certainly moments when public opinion trends more strongly in certain directions than others. In October of 1859, for instance, right after the raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, there were few people who would have openly called him a hero. By December of the same year, however, there was a definite groundswell of support for him. And in the eyes of many across the nation, especially in the northern states, and especially, as I'll say more in a moment, when the New England Transcendentalists got hold of him, he died a hero and a martyr. In his excellent cultural biography, with a long title, stick with me, John Brown, Abolitionist, the man who killed slavery, sparked the Civil War, and ceded civil rights, historian David Reynolds delineates the shifting fortunes of Brown's reputation, both during his lifetime, when the New England Transcendentalists led the effort to rehabilitate him, both right before and immediately after his death, and on into the 21st century, citing the wide range of groups and individuals who have, many erroneously, cited Brown as an inspiration. That list includes the Fenians, a Civil War-era militant Irish group, the International Working People's Association, Eugene V. Debs, perennial socialist candidate for the United States presidency. The Weather Underground. Violent anti-abortion activists Matthew Goldsby, John Burt, and Paul Hill, who bombed clinics in the 1990s. And Timothy McVeigh. In my view, Reynolds is quite good at weighing out which claims might have merit and which are, in my words, quite frankly, preposterous. Think Timothy McVeigh. For my sources on Brown, I want to think briefly with you about James McBride's The Good Lord Bird, the National Book Award-winning novel that's been adapted as a miniseries. Anybody know who that is? That's Ethan Hawke. Yeah, I know, right? In February of 2020 on Showtime, The Good Lord Bird is going to be shown as an 8-part miniseries. Ethan Hawke is playing John Brown in this series. And then at slightly greater length after I talk about The Good Lord Bird, the novel, about the first volume of a new graphic novel. It's actually a series. It's called Thunderbolt, An American Tale, by Wilfred Santiago, which appeared in September of this year. I am curious to know if there are folks here who've read The Good Lord Bird. Okay. And I couldn't resist. On the right is McBride's Harriet Tubman novel. So he's written a John Brown novel, The Good Lord Bird, which got a lot of notice and in fact won the National Book Award. But he also wrote, to my mind, an equally interesting novel about Harriet Tubman that did not get as much press, but came out around 2008. All right. The Good Lord Bird is kind of a narrative wild ride. It's a lot of fun, largely because the narrator presents John Brown as sort of a tattered monomaniac, his toes sticking through the front of his boots, whose obsessions are the stuff of comedy. Here's a description of Brown blessing a meal. I ought to give you a full sample of old John Brown's prayers, but I reckon they wouldn't make sense to the dear reader who's no doubt sitting in a warm church basement 100 years distant. He was a plain terror in the praying department. Just when he seemed to wrap up one thought, another came tumbling out and crashed up against the first, and then another. And after a while, they all bumped and crashed and commingled till you didn't know who was who and why he was praying it. For the whole thing come together like the tornadoes that whipped across the plains, gathering up the sagebrush and boll weevils and homesteads and tossing them about like dust. The narrator is one Henry Onion Shackelford, a former slave whom John Brown liberates from his Kansas master and adopts as a sort of human good luck charm. He adopts him because Henry eats the onion, which was John Brown's good luck charm, before he gave it to, and that's how he gets the nickname. So, through a comical series of events, Henry ends up disguising himself as Henrietta, a little girl. And throughout the arc of the novel, which follows Brown's career from Kansas to the end, he lives believing that he has Brown fooled, a deception that he understands as essential to his survival. To his and the reader's extreme surprise, when Onion decides to visit Brown right before his execution, the old warrior reveals that he has known all along that Onion was in drag, but has never felt the need or desire to question or judge his protege's self-representation. As he says by way of parting, "Whatever you is, Onion, be it full. God is no respecter of persons. I loves you, Onion. Look in on my family from time to time." It's an arresting moment for me that instantaneously transformed this John Brown from murderous, monomaniacal buffoon into a more deeply thoughtful figure whose fundamental living out of his convictions sprung from compassion. Kindness was what mattered, not judgment. And I think at the end of the day, that's the main work of this novel, to dismantle the image of the madman in favor of a glimpse at his humanity. I can't wait to see whether or how the filmic rendering of the novel takes that up. I'm rather inclined to think it will, because I think we need a human tolerant, insightful justice warrior right now, more than we need an egotistical, obsessive, potentially violent madman. I'll leave that. If the good Lord bird seeks to pull back from the popular image of the avenging angel of abolitionism, Thunderbolt, An American Tale, leans hard into that notion. The graphic novel's John Brown is a skeletal, wild-eyed, bearded madman whose hands and sword drip with blood in multiple frames of the narrative. Operating under the belief that God has called him to wreak havoc on the slavers, this John Brown wields the thunderbolt of divine retribution with maniacal zeal. We don't judge him negatively for it, however, because the text makes sure that we understand the source and rationale for this zeal. Now, there's a whole article to be written about the big picture significance of this text. But right now, I want to focus on a key feature of Brown's costume. Here on his right lapel, you may be able to see he has a button on his lapel. What the button says is anti. All right? And in the penultimate panels of the novel, we learn that Brown's son Jason made the button from, quote, a broken compass that, quote, only pointed north. What that means, of course, is that the compass isn't broken at all, that it did exactly what it was supposed to do. And given that insight, the reader is to understand that there on John Brown's chest sits the modification of a working compass, a physical representation of his moral compass, if you will. He cannot lose his way, as it were, so long as he stays true to his divinely dictated purpose. The reader, by extension, then, can't get off track and lose sight of the fundamental validity and sacredness of Brown's cause. If we judge him, the symbolism of the old compass dictates that we judge him positively. There's also a link to the present that I believe makes a similar determination about how we are to view present-day radicals. In this context, the wording on the button matters a great deal. Anti is an open signifier, dependent on the existence of something else for meaning. In the historical world that the graphic novel presents, one obvious suffix is slavery, since that's very clearly the motivator for the raids at Potawatomi and Osawatomie that we see in such gory detail. But in our cultural moment, other endings suggest themselves. Most compellingly, F-A. Santiago's Brown is a man possessed, a man willing to spill blood to end oppression, an avenging angel of the left, as it were. While I'm not here to weigh in on what I think about Antifa, I must point out that if I'm right about Santiago's positive correlation of Brown with armed resistance against fascist oppression, then he's caught a segment of the national temperature very accurately. Consider groups like the John Brown gun clubs springing up around the nation now. Groups of left-leaning gun rights activists that in the wake of events like the murder of Heather Heyer at the Unite the Right March in Charlottesville, Virginia, have organized and armed themselves to protect sympathetic protesters who, because of their commitment to nonviolence, might fall victim to violence at the hands of the alt-right. To my knowledge, there hasn't yet been a documented incident where a John Brown gun clubber has actually shot anyone. So far, this movement remains untested on that level. But if we broaden the scope a bit to include Antifa, however, then the idea of violent liberalism becomes more concrete. And in my view, that's a bit of a vexed proposition, or at least potentially so. There are, I am certain, individuals who would have no qualms about drawing a line from Brown to Antifa, who would see the correlation as unqualifiedly positive, in fact. That said, I must also observe that it's quite likely many Americans would resist this analogy. Consider this statement about Antifa from the Anti-Defamation League, which I think pretty well captures the broad concerns I'm alluding to. Antifa is not a unified group. It's a loose collection of local, regional groups and individuals. Their presence at a protest is intended to intimidate and dissuade racists, but the use of violent measures by some Antifa against their adversaries can create a vicious, self-defeating cycle of attacks, counterattacks, and blame. That is why most established civil rights organizations criticize Antifa tactics as dangerous and counterproductive. Now, to tie this to John Brown, let's consider briefly the subtitle of Reynolds' book, specifically the last phrase, Seeded the Civil Rights Movement. The national narrative of the civil rights struggle that we have become most comfortable with is one in which noble, long-suffering individuals on the left non-violently receive the hostility and abuse of brutal opponents intent on keeping blacks oppressed. And don't get me wrong, I'm not decrying or undermining the importance or veracity of that narrative. If asked to make a short list of my heroes, I would place Dr. King at or near the top. That said, I think it's fair to say that for many Americans, there's a need for that image of a nonviolent left winning out. We're comfortable with that. And I think that Reynolds might be understanding that when he links Brown, a figure most commonly associated with violence, into that tradition. It's an effort, I believe, to open people's minds about him, to show that he was more than violent in the long run. And he was, because, as Reynolds notes, the writing that Brown did between the time of his capture in October and his execution in December 1859 swayed the nation on the issue of enslavement much more than his actions at Harper's Ferry had. To emphasize that enables a whole group of left-leaning Americans to be comfortable with John Brown. So what then to make of Santiago's graphic novel and the gun clubs? Why is this John Brown abroad in our culture right now, figuratively dripping blood and inspiring individuals to be quite literally armed against injustice? Why do we need this John Brown now? Well, I'd suggest that one answer to that question might be present in the Atlantic Monthly cover that I showed you a few moments ago. We are in this present and, quite frankly, terrifying cultural moment, a very angry nation, a nation divided, and at the heart of much of our division right now is a struggle against white supremacy and a racist backlash arising in the United States, at least partially, I would say, as a response to the Obama presidency. Again, for the Q&A, if you wish. To bring Antifa back into the conversation, although groups associated with their ideology existed before 2017, it was their role in the protection of the crowds and the defense of counter-protesters at the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally that brought them into the public eye. A role, incidentally, that they shared with John Brown Gun Club chapters and members of the Redneck Revolt network of anti-fascist, anti-racist militias that has sprung up across the nation since 2016. In some ways, 2019 is not that different from 1859. Or at least one can see similarities in the codification of governmental oppression and the enactment of violence against othered bodies, achieving intolerable levels of support across broad swaths of the American body politic. So we need John Brown right now because there's real cultural power in the idea of holy warriors who will stand up against violence and oppression, enacted by the allies and admirers of those white supremacists. Of course, John Brown's not for everyone. And so that's why we also need other types of imagery associated with the Underground Railroad. Or perhaps it might be more accurate to say something like that's why artists and activists are using the idea of the Underground Railroad so liberally and creatively right now. Whether by revolutionary violence or by organized movement away from bondage, and the violence in the movement can be real or imaginary, as I've tried to illustrate, many Americans are resisting individual and institutional oppression, seeking a change from our present way of life. And in their quest, the Underground Railroad, or more accurately, our current vision of it, can once again be a path to freedom, at least symbolically. Thank you.